13 days of panic, 13 days of confusion, 13 days of being afraid of what was coming. 13 days felt forever lasting to those who lived during this time. The possibility of nuclear war was enough to cause this. For 13 days in October of 1962, the world seemed to be at the verge of nuclear war. There was a threatening clash between the US and Soviet Union during the Cold War. These two higher powers came very close to causing the destruction of the world. Thankfully, as you all probably know, this didn't happen. So what did actually happen? Based on memoirs he wrote himself, Premier Nikita Khrushchev, the head of Russia, came up with the idea to place intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Cuba. This was in order to counter the emerging lead of the US in productizing and installing strategic missiles. He announced his plot as a way of protecting Cuba from another US-sponsored takeover, just like their failed attempt in 1961 at the Bay of Pigs. After they had acquired the approval of Fidel Castro, the Soviet Union functioned swiftly and privately to build missile installations in Cuba. In October of 1962, an American U-2 spy plane successfully captured photographs of nuclear missile installations being constructed in Cuba by the Soviet Union. The U.S. government had kept close surveillance of Soviet military buildup on Cuba. Their evidence showed a series of offensive missile sites that were in preparation. The purpose could have only been to give the Soviet Union a nuclear missile strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. A number of them were medium-range ballistic missiles, having the ability of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of greater than 1,000 nautical miles. Each of those missiles had the ability of targeting and hitting almost any major city in the Western Hemisphere. Cuba and the Soviet Union were not aware of the knowledge President John F. Kennedy had acquired. He met with his advisors for a number of days to discuss this issue. After many long meetings, he made up his mind to have a naval blockade placed around Cuba to prevent more military supplies from being brought. Nuclear weapons are so damaging and ballistic missiles are so quick that any increased chance of their use or abrupt change in their positioning may as well be seen as a definite threat to peace. On a televised address on October 22nd, President John F. Kennedy announced his findings of missile installations in Cuba. In defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, authority entrusted President John F. Kennedy had been directed to follow the following steps immediately. First, he had to stop the offensive buildup in Cuba by initiating a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment, which he had already done with the naval blockade. Second was that he had to continue and increase surveillance of Cuba and its military buildup. Third was that a policy would be made that if any nuclear missiles were launched from Cuba to any nation in the Western Hemisphere, it would be regarded as an attack to the U.S. by the Soviet Union, requiring a full retaliatory response. Fourth was that they had to reinforce their base in Guantanamo as a necessary military precaution. Fifth was to call an immediate meeting of the Organization of Consultation under the Organization of American States in order to consider this threat to hemispheric safety. Sixth was to have an emergency meeting of the Security Council be convoked without delay to take action against the great Soviet threat to world peace. Seventh was to call upon Chairman Khrushchev to eliminate and stop this reckless threat to the world.
The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. He has an opportunity now to move the world back from the abyss of destruction.
During the crisis, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union communicated through letters. On October 26, Khrushchev sent Kennedy a long letter proposing that if the U.S. assures him that Cuba would not be invaded, then the missiles would be dismantled. On October 27, Khrushchev wrote another letter to Kennedy suggesting that if the U.S. dismantles their Jupiter missile installations in Turkey, then the Soviet Union would dismantle their missile installations in Cuba. Even though it was risky, Kennedy chose to ignore the second letter, and he gave his response to the first one. During that night, President Kennedy sent his message to Premier Khrushchev proposing the steps that were to be taken place when removing the Soviet missiles from Cuba with the supervision of the United Nations. and a promise that the U.S. wouldn't attack Cuba. The U.S. was planning to remove the Jupiter missiles in Turkey anyway, and that is what they would do in April 1963. They didn't want it to be part of any public resolution of the missile crisis. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced publicly that he would dismantle and remove the missiles in Cuba.
The Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
Radio Moscow at 9 o'clock this morning. Mr. Khrushchev crating up his missiles and shipping them home.
The end of the Cuban Missile Crisis gave everyone a relief. A possible nuclear war that was so close to happening didn't happen. Even though it was at the brink of disaster, the communication between the two countries resolved the situation without any hasty actions being made that would have possibly triggered or initiated the war. Even after the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, the naval quarantine ended on November 20th, 1962, when the IL-28 bombers were removed from Cuba.